Welcome to WHRO's Weekly Edition. I'm Doug Boynton. In this week's program, watch out, land in Eastern Virginia is sinking. Scientists want to find out why. WHRO's Katherine Hafner went to West Point to see their progress.
Maybe not tomorrow or next year or even 10 years, but decades from now, how is that potentially going to impact infrastructure?
Virginia Beach has put out a request for churches and nonprofits to use their land for affordable housing. WHRO's Cianna Morales spoke with an affordable housing advocate in Virginia Beach to learn more. But first, this news update from NPR. It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. The Waterworks in Newport News expects to begin upgrades by 2027 to meet new federal water quality rules. We get the story from WHRO's Nick McNamara.
Director Jan Le Guelec says the Waterworks plans on installing new granular activated carbon filtration, something he says is proven to reduce forever chemicals in drinking water.
Granular activated carbon is a little bit like a Brita filter, but on steroids. It's much bigger.
Forever chemicals are linked to increased risk of certain cancers and reproductive problems and do not break down in the environment. Under new EPA rules effective in 2029, plants like the Waterworks will have to ensure some forever chemicals do not exceed 4 parts per trillion in treated drinking water. While usually meeting that now, Le Guelec says the Waterworks has in the past exceeded the 2029 limit. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
In a report released this week, senators investigating misconduct within the U.S. Coast Guard say they've received testimony from more than 80 whistleblowers. The accounts revealed widespread issues of sexual assault and harassment, a culture of silencing and retaliation, and a failure to hold individuals accountable. The head of the Coast Guard was in Hampton Roads recently. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh says she addressed the services still facing questions from Congress about how it handles sexual harassment claims.
Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Linda Fagan told the crowd of officers that culture is not created in a vacuum.
So hold yourself accountable, lead yourself, but more importantly, create that environment for those around you, the environment that you want to serve in and that you want others to serve alongside you with.
Fagan's comments come as members of Congress continued to accuse the service of not being transparent about sexual harassment complaints at the Coast Guard Academy from the time before Fagan took over as Commandant in 2022. She spoke at the National Naval Officers Association and Association of Naval Service Officers Symposium. The two groups are meeting throughout the week in Norfolk. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
Scientists want to know more about why land is sinking in Eastern Virginia. WHRO's Katherine Hafner reports on the latest effort from the town of West Point.
Inside a shed in the middle of a grassy field, workers with the U.S. Geological Survey are hammering away at a massive steel rod. This device, called an extensometer, will extend 1,400 feet underground to the bottom of the aquifer where we draw our groundwater. But what it's looking for is tiny.
We're measuring submillimeter changes of motion.
That's geologist Greg Connick. He says taking so much water out is a big part of why land is sinking. They want better data so they can understand how that could affect our cities.
Maybe not tomorrow or next year or even 10 years, but decades from now, how is that potentially going to impact infrastructure?
He says the ground beneath our feet is always moving. Katherine Hafner, WHRO News.
There are an estimated 18,000 blind and visually impaired individuals in Virginia, and using the internet can sometimes be a struggle for them. Efforts by the legislature to require state and local government websites to become more accessible failed during this year's General Assembly session, but as Virginia Public Radio's Brad Kuttner found out, one state agency is still working to address the problem.
Tropical storm Debbie looms over southeast.
That's the sound of Bonnie O'Day's vision impairment assistive technology reading content from a website. She's showing me the tech after a recent meeting of the Public Body Procurement Work Group, a committee that studies vendor contracts with Virginia and its localities. At a meeting Tuesday morning, they brought up a bill from Delegate Kathy Tran, which would have set new website accessibility standards across the state. But it was kicked to a study. The The good news, 88% of state agency websites met accessibility standards. The bad news, the thousands of local agencies and school systems that are yet to comply.
So we have a large price tag on this.
That's Chris Carey with Meta Services, a consulting group that works with agencies to address their IT needs. He said the cost of getting so many localities in compliance could be as much as $500 million. Corey Singleton is with Virginia Higher Ed Accessibility Partners. He spoke in favor of new compliance rules. While he understood concerns about costs, he said uneven enactment was an ongoing issue.
It's not happening right now broadly. Institutions are electing to do it, and very few are electing to do it.
Bonnie O'Day, meanwhile, said compliance is a necessity beyond any cost.
Being accessible to people with disabilities is a part of doing business.
The procurement work group will make recommendations ahead of the 2025 legislative session. In Richmond, I'm Brad Kuttner.
By the way, if you are not aware, the WHRO Voice is a streaming radio service for individuals who are blind, visually impaired, or have other conditions preventing them from reading standard printed material. You can find out more at 757-889-9379. I'll repeat that, 757-889-9379. The City of Virginia Beach put out a request for churches and nonprofits interested in using their land for affordable housing development. It's an idea that has worked before in Virginia Beach and in Norfolk, as well as further afield, and the city hopes more organizations getting involved could help address Virginia Beach's shortage of affordable housing. Courtney Pierce is the co-chair of the Affordable Housing Collaborative for Interfaith Alliance at the beach. She spoke with WHRO's Cianna Morales about the idea.
Welcome, Courtney. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us about the work the Interfaith Alliance does in Virginia Beach.
Sure. So the Interfaith Alliance has been around for a really long time, almost a little over 30 years, and we serve as a coalition of faith-based congregations and nonprofits to serve the city of Virginia Beach, to really meet those social justice needs and issues. And one of the issues that has always been a part of the Interfaith Alliance at the beach, or IAB for short, is the issue of affordable and obtainable housing.
The City of Virginia Beach recently put out a request to nonprofit and religious organizations to consider using some of their land for affordable housing development. How is the Interfaith Alliance involved in that idea?
In conversations with the city and in conversations with, faith communities, we know that affordable housing is a huge issue and it's a crisis within our nation, and then particularly here in our area. We had a fireside chat where the city of Virginia Beach was invited to come to talk about this upcoming RFI that they were putting out to many of the churches that we have been working with. They were able to look through a database and find churches that have land that might be able to be utilized. And also many churches have reached out to the city themselves about the additional land that they have and how they can utilize that.
What would that use of land look like? Would that be new houses or apartments built, or using an existing church structure?
What they're looking for is more than likely will be some sort of new development on the land that is being utilized by the church.
What kind of need is this project fulfilling in Virginia Beach?
It fills the need of being able to have some sort of housing that is supporting a marginalized community, so increasing tenancy for those folks so that they're not displaced from housing. And I think on the end of the church, it's an opportunity for faith communities to, do what we have been doing in the community, supporting the community, but also branching out into this sector of housing.
Are there places either locally or further afield where this idea has been put into action?
Yeah, there are a couple of places in Northern Virginia where they have taken churches and revamped the church to create affordable housing, mainly for older adults. There's also been a project in Asheville, North Carolina called the Beloved Community, where they took an acre of land from a Presbyterian church and they built 12 micro homes on them, so housing between 400 to 600 square feet. A little bit different. They've taken a high school, which is in Franklin, the Hayden Village project. They reconstructed that to provide support for older adult communities.
Is there anything else related to this issue that's important to consider?
I think collaboration on this issue is the only way we're really going to make a dent in it. And we know the beauty of what it means when you collaborate together and we get things done.
Thank you so much for joining us, Courtney. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for allowing us to share.
That was Courtney Pierce with the Interfaith Alliance at the beach. Still ahead on Weekly Edition, after record-setting high tides in Norfolk last year, NOAA provides this year's forecast. Also, a debriefing of sorts after the USS Eisenhower returned home from a demanding deployment in the Middle East. But first, according to Fort Monroe Authority leaders, the first sculpture for a planned African landing memorial at Old Point Comfort is expected next year. The report comes from WHRO's Nick McNamara.
CEO Glenn Oder says he wants the Memorial Plaza to spark reflection and a deeper understanding of the story of America.
The memorial is a storyline, and the storyline actually starts in Africa. It tells about their life in Africa. We talk about the Middle Passage. We talk about resistance.
The memorial will acknowledge the site as the point of arrival for the first enslaved African people to be brought to English North America in 1619. Florida-based sculptor Brian Owens will be responsible for the artwork in the memorial. Plans for the plaza include multiple sculptures and a relief wall with a window framing the way to Angola, where those first Africans forced to journey to Virginia were taken from. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
A marijuana dispensary run by a Native American tribe will sell North Carolina's first recreational marijuana despite a continuing state ban. Lily Knepp from Blue Ridge Public Radio has the story.
Great Smoky Cannabis Dispensary announced on social media that sales will begin at 10 a.m. on Saturday, September 7th, asking followers, "Are you ready to be part of history?" The dispensary on the Qualla Boundary first made history in April, when it opened for medical sales in the state where marijuana is still illegal. In June, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Tribal Council amended its cannabis ordinance, allowing for recreational sales beginning in July, but only to members of federally recognized tribes. No additional details about the September opening to the public have been posted to the dispensary's website since Thursday's announcement. I'm Lily Knepp, BPR News.
State officials say Virginia's tourism industry had its best year ever in 2023. WHRO's Ryan Murphy was on the story.
Tourism in the state has largely recovered from the losses it suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic, with visitors spending a whopping $33.3 billion last year. That's nearly 10% higher than in 2022, according to a new analysis from the Virginia Tourism Corporation. The influx in visitors also resulted in thousands more travel-related jobs, bringing employment in the sector up to 93% of pre-pandemic totals. The study doesn't detail how the growth was distributed around the state. The VTC says it will release data by locality in a few weeks. Virginia is on pace for another strong year of tourism this year, with airports across the state reporting record-breaking passenger figures in recent months. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Sports tourism is big money, and representatives from the historic Triangle hope Williamsburg's upcoming indoor sports center will attract fans, participants, and yes, their money to the area. WHRO's Nick McNamara reports.
The 200,000-square-foot Williamsburg Sports and Events Center is slated to open in 2026. Here's Williamsburg Mayor Doug Pons.
This facility will be a shared landmark, a community asset to enjoy for many decades.
The project is a joint venture of the city, York, and James City counties. With sports tourism in Virginia estimated to draw billions in spending, officials want to increase the share of those dollars spent in Greater Williamsburg. The center comes with an $80 million price tag and will include 12 basketball courts, climbing walls, and meeting space. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Norfolk set a record last year for flooding from high tides, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. WHRO's Katherine Hafner has the agency's new predictions for this year.
NOAA outlines how much high tide flooding coastal cities should expect between May and the following April. That means when tides reach a foot or two above average and cover typically dry land. Hampton Roads is all too familiar with this type of sunny day flooding. NOAA oceanographer Karen Kavanaugh cited Norfolk residents as an example.
They're facing traffic, dropping their kids off to school or getting to work because there's water that's flooding the streets and not necessarily because of a storm.
Norfolk saw a record-breaking 23 days of high tide flooding last year because of the El Niño weather pattern on top of rising sea levels. This year, NOAA says the city can expect a bit less, up to 15 days. Katherine Hafner, WHRO News.
North Carolina's Medicaid program will now cover over-the-counter contraceptives. The report from WUNC's Will Michaels.
Low-income residents who get their health insurance through Medicaid can now get the contraceptive O-pill at no cost without a prescription. O-pill is a daily contraceptive pill and the first such medication to be approved by the FDA for over-the-counter use. The State Department of Health and Human Services says there are now more than 330 pharmacies enrolled as providers in Medicaid. The legislature approved and the governor signed a bill to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act last year. Pharmacies started enrolling in the program at the beginning of this year. I'm Will Michaels.
Break dancing is now an Olympic sport for the first time at the 2024 Paris Games. WHRO's Cianna Morales spoke with an Old Dominion University dance professor and former break dancer about the sport's debut.
James Morrow learned breaking as a kid in Chicago in the 80s. Now he teaches hip-hop dance at ODU. Morrow says he has mixed feelings about breaking at the Olympics. On one hand,
we have 32 incredibly strong, well-versed movers that are throwing down on an Olympic stage and demonstrating embodied movement in the most complex way, right? And in that way, it's oh, that's amazing.
On the other hand, he worries originators of the art form, Black and Latino women and men who pioneered hip-hop culture in the 70s, won't feel represented by the Olympic event. The breaking competitions in Paris air Friday and Saturday. Cianna Morales, WHRO News.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
A regional commission that manages fisheries along the East Coast decided to study more restrictions on the controversial menhaden harvest in the Chesapeake Bay. WHRO's Katherine Hafner reports.
This week's vote by the Commission's Atlantic Menhaden Board opens the door to limiting menhaden fishing in the bay to certain areas or times. Environmental and sport fishing groups have long been concerned that menhaden is declining in the bay. They say that's affecting species that rely on it as a food source, like osprey and striped bass. Here's board member Lynn Fegley at the meeting.
While we don't lay all this at the feet of the large purse-seine fisheries, we believe it is common sense to alleviate stress where we can control it.
Menhaden harvester Omega Protein pushes back against any notion of a decline in the fish population. Officials say more research is still needed to truly understand what's happening in the water. Katherine Hafner, WHRO News.
The USS Eisenhower aircraft carrier returned home last month after what its commanding officer called the most active Navy deployment since World War II. It was in the Red Sea trying to contain the conflict in the Middle East, and the deployment demonstrated how the Navy is likely to fight in the future. WHRO's Steve Walsh reports.
The USS Eisenhower had F-18s in the air nearly every day during its 7 months in the Red Sea. Marvin Scott, the commander of Carrier Wing 3, says it was the busiest deployment he had ever seen.
When we were established in the Red Sea, we were flying 6 to 7 days per week, sometimes launching alerts at night, anywhere between 80 and 120 to sometimes 140 sorties per day. Very, very busy operational tempo.
The Ike left Norfolk days after war broke out between Israel and Hamas. By the end of the year, the strike group moved into the Red Sea as Houthi rebels in Yemen began disrupting international shipping. Scott says the carrier's F-18 strike fighters shot down around 60 drones launched by the Iranian-backed group. He says pilots learned that drones are difficult to see on the plane's radar.
The other difference is you're generally not defending yourself, you're defending someone else. It's not going to hit you, it's going to hit the several hundred people on the USS Philippine Sea. And the Air Wing took that very seriously.
The The carrier only saw 2 port calls over the 9-month deployment because of the constant threat from a host of weapons.
The most complex series of engagements that the Navy has seen since World War II, absolutely.
After the carrier pulled into port, Captain Chris Hill said the mission was a learning experience for the Navy.
There's a lot of firsts that happen, getting to go up against unmanned vehicles, aerial vehicles, surface vessels, unmanned underwater vehicles. And then, of course, anti-ship ballistic missiles, which we had never seen before. It was next level in terms of complexity.
Another first, the carrier included ship-wide Wi-Fi to help morale. Hill became a minor celebrity on social media, initially posting about Navy life like Taco Tuesday. But when inaccurate reports surfaced first on social media and then in news stories that the Houthis had successfully attacked the Eisenhower, Hill countered with video of planes landing and sailors below deck.
I was already doing that before the Houthis got involved. So I was telling the truth like I did every day, and so there was a question about the integrity of the ship and whether or not there was a hole in it. All I had to do was show a video that there was not a hole in it and just display normal Navy life.
Brian Clark is a former naval officer who is now with the Hudson Institute. He says for the Houthis, social media posts declaring that the Ike was in flames are a way of throwing sand in the gears to make people lose trust in what they're seeing from the West and their allies.
The Navy is now starting to figure out that that's a piece of the job that they have to address and make sure that the commanders are prepared when they get out there to do this.
The Navy has a number of high-tech weapons in the pipeline, such as lasers, which would lower the cost of doing battle against relatively cheap low-tech drones and missiles, like those provided by Iran. There are a lot of off-the-shelf technology the Navy could use to upgrade its ships right now, Clark says.
And these are all technologies that exist, and the Army has been using them. The Navy is just catching up now to how do you deal with a threat that the Army's been facing for about a decade.
The USS Roosevelt has taken over for the Ike in the Red Sea, as the Houthis show no sign of ending their campaign against international shipping. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
Navy Secretary Carlos Del Toro paid a surprise visit to Virginia Beach to thank the air crews of the USS Eisenhower at Cianna. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh had that story as well.
The 3rd Air Wing arrived home in July. The air crews for the USS Eisenhower Strike Group were part of the busiest deployment for the Navy since World War II, spending 7 months in the Red Sea over a 9-month deployment. Navy Secretary Carlos Del Toro said he thanked them for their commitment.
To be able to gain this experience is an extraordinary thing. And I shared with them that actually they will be the mentors to our future aviators.
The U.S. continues a naval buildup in the Middle East as Iran vows to retaliate for an Israeli attack that killed a Hamas leader.
We will sustain this op tempo as long as we have to, but obviously we don't want to sustain it as long as we have to. We want to try to reach a diplomatic solution in Gaza.
The Norfolk-based USS Truman is expected to deploy to the Middle East in the fall. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from Steve Walsh, Ryan Murphy, Katherine Hafner, Cianna Morales, and Nick McNamara. Brad Kuttner with Virginia Public Radio, Lily Knapp with Blue Ridge Public Radio, and WUNC's Will Michaels. Also thanks as always to Connor Worley, who produced today's broadcast. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed, and you can get news updates at WHRO.org, the WHRO smartphone app, and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.